Thank you, everyone. Good afternoon. I hope you're having a good day so far. My name is Huang, and today we will be discussing AWS Auto Scaling with load balancers. Before we dive in, I'd like to thank Codesmith, Jeeny, and Bractlet for sponsoring this Tech Talk. So here's a little overview of what we will be covering today. First, I'm going to introduce you to the concept of auto scaling. I'm also going to cover the types and strategies of auto scaling. Then I'm going to move on to talk about the benefits in using auto scaling. Finally, we are going to be also talking about how to configure an auto scaling group, as well as the differences between auto scaling and load balancing. We will conclude today's presentation with a short demonstration to see everything put in action. All right, so let's imagine that you have an application running on a virtual machine and it's processing requests made by users. In this scenario, there's only a single user, so the server is able to support the load in response with the necessary data. With its request fulfilled, the user is happy. So let's say that your application is gaining in popularity and that the user invited a couple more of his friends to also use the application. When too many requests are sent, the single server may not be able to handle the load, which may result in the application slowing down or worse, crashing. With their requests unfulfilled, the users are unhappy. But that's okay though. We can actually rectify the situation by making a copy of the virtual machine and horizontally scaling. So kind of like this, we can add a load balancer to distribute traffic in between the running instances. But there's just one question though. What if the load drastically increases? Okay, let's add a couple more instances and register them with the load balancer, kind of like this. And if the load drops, let's terminate those instances to reflect the reduction in the load. This process is an example of manual scaling, which can be repetitive, tedious, and unreliable. So we can actually automate the process of auto scaling in response to the changing demand by using an auto scaling group. Once again, the users are happy because their requests are fulfilled. So the definition of auto scaling is that it is a cloud computing technique to automatically adjust the computing resources of your application based on the load of the server farm. Since too much capacity can lead to underutilized and wasted resources, and too little can lead to applications slowing down or crashing, auto scaling allows you to maintain just the right amount of resources to adapt to the load. There are also a couple types of auto scaling: vertical scaling and horizontal scaling. Let's use EC2 as an example, which is basically a virtual machine. Vertical scaling adjusts the number of CPU cores or memory to go up or down. For the sake of this talk, we will be focusing on horizontal scaling, which is adding or removing the number of resources, kind of like the example that you saw earlier. There are also a couple of scaling strategies. Scaling strategies informs the auto scaling on how to optimize the resource allocation and when to scale. In schedule scaling, capacity scales based on a set schedule. So for example, let's say that you have a restaurant application. You probably want to provision more capacity during the time when the restaurant is open and decrease the capacity when the restaurant is closed overnight. So that is an example of schedule scaling. In dynamic scaling, capacity scales in response to live changes in utilization. A common metric is CPU utilization. So when an auto scaling group detects an increase in CPU utilization, it will provision more resources and adjust reactively. In predictive scaling, capacity scales based on predictive demands. It actually utilizes machine learning to regularly forecast for future workload. However, the drawback to this method, though, is that the quality of the forecast is greatly dependent on how much data you have and how cyclical the historical data is. So now that we've talked about the types of scaling and the scaling strategies, let's talk about the benefits of using auto scaling. There are many benefits of using auto scaling, as you can see. The scalability and elasticity of your application is greatly increased, as you saw in the horizontal scaling feature. You're able to scale in or out very easily. Auto scaling group also increases the reliability and availability of the application drastically by detecting unhealthy instances and replacing them with healthy one instantly. So that greatly increased the fault tolerance of your application. Auto scaling group also has another feature which supports multiple availability zones. So when you configure your auto scaling group to support multiple availability zones, your application becomes more reliable, because when an availability zones or data center becomes unavailable, the auto scaling group will automatically launch new instances in another availability zone. ASG is also flexible in providing instances when you need it and how you need it through the different scaling strategies that we just saw in the previous slide. And that flexibility provides you better cost management since you're not provisioning additional resources. All right, so I'm gonna ask for a little bit of audience participation. Please take out your phone and actually scan this QR code, which will take you to my demo application to simulate increase in traffic. I will also try to Slack out this link if you're unable to scan the QR. And I'll drop that in our chat. Give you a couple seconds and just make sure that you refresh the page a couple of times to simulate the traffic that you are sending to the application. All right, so I think everybody got that. So let's keep moving on. Now that we have a foundational understanding of auto scaling, you may want to know how you would go about configuring an auto scaling group. And AWS actually supports many different resources such as DynamoDB, RDS, ECS, and Lambda, just to name a few. But for today's talk, we'll be mainly focusing on configuring an EC2 auto scaling group. So there are actually three main components to configure an ASG here. First, you wanted to create a launch template. Then you wanted to create an auto scaling group. And finally, you want to specify the scaling policy. In creating a launch template, it basically is a template to tell your EC2 instance or virtual machine what to make that instance after. It's kind of like your recipe in making a cookie or baking a cupcake. So in that template, you wanted to specify the template name, the version description, the AMI, which is your operating system, as well as instance type and key pair that allows you to log in or SSH into your EC2 instance. And finally, network settings, which talks about virtual firewall policies. Once you have that configured, you will then move on to component number 2, which is the bread and butter. You will be creating an auto scaling group. First, you will want to point that to the launch template that you had just created. And also, if you want your ASG to support multiple availability zones, you want to specify that here as well. Then if your application has a load balancer, you will also want to link the load balancer to this ASG. Health checks allows your ASG to detect unhealthy instances. So it's usually an endpoint on a server. Finally, in group size, you wanted to define this so that your auto scaling group is maintained within a certain size. This may be the minimum number of instances that you want your ASG to support or maximum number of instances. So you would just sort of configure those. Finally, you will move on to specifying the scaling policy, which tells your auto scaling group when and how you want it to scale. There are some common target tracking scaling policy, including CPU utilization, network in, network out, as well as the request count per target. on the load balancer. So now that we've covered the configuration of an auto scaling group, you may be asking, what is the difference between auto scaling and load balancing? Well, I wanted to emphasize that auto scaling is not an alternative to replace load balancers. The two actually work in tandem. Auto scaling is responsible in registering the available instances with the load balancer, and the load balancer will automatically distribute traffic in between those running instances. So you can actually think of a load balancer kind of like a traffic director directing traffic, but they are unable to scale in or out. The scaling in or out is done by the auto scaling, which contains the logic. In summary, auto scaling group is all about providing sufficient capacity to maintain the resource utilization and application performance. Auto scaling also increases the elasticity of the cloud infrastructure by making it easy to scale up and down, in and out. Reliability and availability is greatly increased by using auto scaling because the application becomes more fault tolerant and is always available. AWS EC2 auto scaling group configuration consists of 3 main components, which includes launch template, ASG, and scaling policy. So that is the end of our presentation. These are my sources, and I thank you for your time today, and this has been a pleasure talking to you. If you have any more questions, you can reach out to me on these contact links. And if you'd like to check out my demo app, you can check out my GitHub repo. Thank you so much for joining.